Picture, if you will, the most sophisticated civilization rating system in galactic history, the Humanitarian Intervention Probability Matrix. Developed by the Altarian Institute for Strategic Compassion, yes, that's a real department with actual funding, this mathematical marvel could calculate the precise worthiness of any species suffering within zero point 0.3 standard cycles. Trade value, political alignment, resource availability, cultural compatibility, and something charmingly called future reciprocity potential, all fed into elegant algorithms that determined who deserved salvation and who could kindly expire in silence. The system worked flawlessly for 3 centuries, efficiently distributing galactic sympathy to those who mattered most. Until the day Captain Vex Korath of the Zeltharian Republic stumbled into the emergency session of the Interstellar Humanitarian Council, his uniform singed and his dignity somewhere in the vicinity of absolute zero. "Honored delegates," Korath began, his translator struggling with what appeared to be barely controlled panic. "Our star has begun an accelerated decay sequence. Solar flares are sterilizing our outer colonies. We have perhaps 40 cycles before our homeworld becomes uninhabitable." The assembled diplomats exchanged those carefully practiced expressions of concern that cost nothing and committed to less. Ambassador Thys of the Altarian Federation consulted her datapad with the enthusiasm of someone reviewing tax documentation. "Captain Korath, while your situation is certainly regrettable, the matrix indicates your species ranks 847th in intervention priority. Your trade agreements are minimal, your military contribution to galactic security is essentially decorative, and frankly, your recent neutrality vote on the hegemony expansion protocols was noted." Korath's mandibles clicked in what any reasonable being would recognize as desperation. "Ambassador, we're talking about 12 billion lives." "Yes, but they're politically inconvenient lives," Director Quenmore of the hegemony interjected smoothly. "The Matrix doesn't lie, Captain. Your species simply hasn't invested in the relationships necessary for large-scale evacuation support. Perhaps you should have considered that before maintaining your quaint independence." The beautiful logic was unassailable. The Zeltharians had spent centuries focusing on art, philosophy, and sustainable technology instead of building military alliances and trade dependencies. How wonderfully naive of them to think that would matter when their son decided to throw a tantrum. Korath tried the crystalline consortium next. Their response arrived with mathematical precision. Evacuation costs would exceed potential returns by 340%. The Void Runners claimed scheduling conflicts. Apparently, their fleet was committed to a mining operation that coincidentally happened to be in hegemony space. The Ethereal Collective offered thoughts and prayers, which was generous considering their usual policy of offering nothing at all. For 6 cycles, Korath ping-ponged between embassies, his requests growing more desperate and his dignity more theoretical. Each rejection came with perfectly reasonable explanation that somehow failed to address the minor detail of 12 billion sentient beings facing extinction. Then the humans showed up. Commander Elena Vasquez entered the emergency session like a weather system nobody had predicted. Direct, disruptive, and completely indifferent to established atmospheric conditions. She listened to Korath's presentation with the kind of attention that suggested she was actually processing the words rather than calculating political angles. 40 cycles until total evacuation needed? She asked. 36 now, Korath replied, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated bureaucratic trauma. Fleet capacity? Our ships can move perhaps 2 million. We need transport for the remaining 10 billion, plus infrastructure to establish colonies. The chamber fell silent except for the subtle hum of translation matrices and the soft clicking of Thys, tabulating the impossibility of the request. Vasquez stood there for exactly 12 seconds. The narrator knows because several delegates actually timed it, before delivering the sentence that would reshape galactic humanitarian policy forever. Will help. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Thys nearly dropped her datapad. Quenmore's breathing apparatus made a sound like a deflating balloon. 3 minor delegates began speaking simultaneously in languages their translators gave up trying to process. Commander, Thys managed, surely you understand the complexity of such an undertaking. The matrix clearly indicates. I don't care what your matrix indicates. Vasquez interrupted, with the casual authority of someone who had never met a bureaucratic procedure she couldn't ignore. 12 billion people need help. We have ships. The mathematics seem pretty straightforward. But the cost-benefit analysis will be that we sleep better at night. And there it was, the fundamental difference that would echo through diplomatic circles for decades. While the galaxy's greatest minds had spent cycles calculating the political wisdom of compassion, the humans had apparently skipped straight to the part where they did something about it. How refreshingly primitive of them. Korath stared at Vasquez with the expression of someone who had forgotten that straightforward answers to desperate questions were theoretically possible. Commander, we cannot offer significant compensation. Our resources are limited, our political influence negligible. Captain, Vasquez replied, we're not running a business here. We're preventing a genocide. The return on investment is not having to explain to our children why we let 12 billion people die because it wasn't profitable enough to save them. The human fleet that arrived in Zeltharian space 3 cycles later looked like the result of a particularly enthusiastic garage sale. Cargo haulers designed for grain transport flew alongside luxury cruise liners, still advertising romantic getaways to the Centauri Nebula. A decommissioned zoo ship, complete with artificial habitats and what appeared to be a small amusement park, docked next to military transports that had been hastily retrofitted with civilian sleeping quarters. Commander Vasquez coordinated the operation from her flagship while simultaneously horrifying every military strategist within 3 sectors. Her evacuation plan violated approximately 47 established protocols for refugee management, ignored 16 safety regulations, and completely bypassed the standard 200-page pre-deployment impact assessment. We're loading families into the cargo bays of freight ships, Ambassador Thiss observed with the tone typically reserved for describing war crimes. The safety certifications alone are less important than the fact that those families will be alive to complain about the accommodations, Vasquez replied, watching as another transport filled with Zeltharian refugees lifted off from the increasingly unstable planet below. The humans had somehow transformed evacuation logistics into a form of organized chaos that shouldn't have worked but absolutely did. Civilian volunteers coordinated with military personnel who took orders from merchant captains who deferred to whoever seemed to know what they were doing at any given moment. The chain of command resembled a particularly creative interpretation of organizational theory. Captain Korath found himself aboard a former entertainment vessel where Zeltharian children played in ball pits while their parents received medical attention in what had previously been a casino. Commander, this is highly irregular. Captain, your son is throwing radiation tantrums that could sterilize a moon. Regular went out the airlock about the time we decided to use a circus transport as a refugee ship. The circus transport in question, the Stellar Spectacular, had become the evacuation's crown jewel of improvisation. Its animal habitats now house Zeltharian elders who appreciated the climate control, while the main performance arena served as a community center where families could locate each other. The irony of refugees finding safety in a ship designed for entertainment wasn't lost on anyone, though the humans seemed to find it more amusing than inappropriate. Meanwhile, the galactic powers watched this humanitarian circus with growing alarm. Emergency sessions convened to address what Director Quenmore termed the human precedent problem. They're making us look bad, Thiss complained during a closed-door meeting that wasn't nearly as closed as she'd hoped. Every species in the Outer Rim is asking why the humans could mobilize a rescue fleet in 3 cycles when we've been deliberating for weeks. Worse, Quenmore added, they're doing it without proper authorization, impact studies, or cost-benefit analysis. It's completely irresponsible. And completely successful, noted the Crystalline Consortium's representative with the bitter tone of someone watching their carefully calculated indifference become a public relations disaster. The evacuation proceeded with the kind of efficiency that could only emerge from people who cared more about results than procedures. Human ships ferried Zeltharians to temporary colonies established on worlds that other species had deemed unsuitable for development, apparently because they lacked strategic value rather than habitability. By the time Zelthar's sun entered its final destructive phase, the last transport had cleared the system. 12 billion Zeltharians found themselves scattered across 17 worlds, alive and complaining about everything from the food to the gravity to the humans' inexplicable habit of playing music during crisis situations. The aftermath proved more uncomfortable than the crisis itself. Galactic media began asking pointed questions about the humanitarian intervention probability matrix and why it had failed to account for the possibility that someone might actually prioritize lives over politics. Academic papers emerged with titles like The Zeltharian Precedent, When Compassion Bypasses Calculation, and Human Irrationality as Effective Policy. The truth, when it finally emerged through leaked diplomatic communications, was beautifully simple. Every major galactic power possessed the resources to have conducted the evacuation easily. The Altarian Federation alone had enough unused transport capacity to have moved the entire Zeltharian population in 2 weeks. The hegemony's logistics network could have established permanent colonies within a month. They simply chose not to because the Matrix had calculated that helping the Zeltharians offered insufficient political returns. The humans apparently had never bothered to run those calculations. They'd heard 12 billion people need help and responded with, okay, let's help them. The revolutionary concept of treating humanitarian crises as humanitarian problems rather than political opportunities had somehow escaped the galaxy's most sophisticated civilizations. Captain Korath, now serving as liaison between the scattered Zeltharian communities and their human benefactors, often reflected on the cosmic joke of it all. His people had spent centuries believing that advancement meant complexity, that wisdom required calculation, that civilization demanded careful consideration of every action's broader implications. Then along came the humans, who'd saved 12 billion lives because it seemed like the right thing to do. The galaxy's most primitive species, it turned out, had been the only ones civilized enough to help.